So one of the things that I think we need to talk about within the personalities, within the way that John and Berenger are, is essentially a conflict that we have with the absurd and also with the existential. Um, John is responsible. He takes responsibility for his actions. He feels very strongly about the way that other people act around him. He wants to conform and be a good member of society. He wants to basically be a good person, right? Um, and by good person, we have to define that according to what John says. And John says, right, that being a good person involves, again, right, not drinking too much, being responsible, presenting yourself well in society, right? All of the sort of the external, right? You want people to know by your appearance and by your actions, right, in public, that you're a good person. Berenger, on the other hand, for him, getting by is enough, right? There isn't enough time for him, it feels, to really figure out how to deal with life, right? He is dealing with life as he can because it's coming at him so fast and he can't deal with it, right? Because he is unable to. I think we'd look at him and say he's a nervous wreck. He's a nervous wreck. He's not a happy person. We don't know much about either of these two from before the play begins, but we certainly can see that from our point of view, John has his life together, Berenger does not. When the rhinoceros shows up, Berenger deals with it the way that he deals with everything. Who cares? It was a rhinoceros, it came through. Why do we care? Why do we care where it came from? It happened, and it's over, and yes, it flattened somebody's cat, and that's terrible, but what are you going to do, right? There's a rhinoceros, and it came through, and that's what it is. John, on the other hand, really wants to know where it came from, what's going on, what's happening, why is society changing, what is he missing, right? We suddenly see when society is presented with some disruption that John has more difficulty than Berenger. Berenger doesn't have less difficulty than he did before, he just isn't affected by it as much. And this does bring up a really important question. If by the end of the play we see that Berenger is the one who survives, right? He's the one who does not transform. John, ends up being one of the earlier ones to transform. Does responsibility, does being a good member of society shield us from the effects of becoming a rhinoceros? As Ionesco would probably point out, right, if we look between the lines and read into what the play is, does being a good member of society mean that you're not going to turn to an offensive and a terrible, political position, right? We are looking at fascism, right? UNESCO doesn't necessarily mention Nazism because at that point in time, right, when this play comes out, the Nazis are pretty much persona non grata in Europe at this point in time, right? Germany's already sort of dealt with the fact that they can't allow that kind of thing to happen anymore, but nationalism, fascism still exists in Europe, right, especially in Romania, and the idea of fascism, right, is a big one, right? Right, fascist states are still a thing that is a concern for people, right? And John doesn't seem to have much difficulty getting there, right? He seems to understand fairly quickly that if society is changing, if he doesn't change, he's going to be on the outside. Berenger has nowhere else to go, right? Berenger's already on the outside. He's got no further to fall. And so in a way, we are left with a kind of an unpleasant choice. We see John. We see how his fall from grace is sort of easily, understood. But we look at Berenger, and we don't necessarily see, right, a lack of a fall from grace. We just see an inability to rise to maybe a level of caring to become a fascist, right? Does he care enough to become a fascist? He doesn't really. At the end of the play, we have our probably most complicated moment, right? Looking at John sitting in his apartment, Berenger sitting in his apartment, and after Daisy leaves, right? he is on his own, and he says, I could become one of them, right? And he decides to try to bellow. He tries to become this, right? In the film, right, we see Gene Wilder's character, Stanley, right? Doing the same thing, trying to figure out, can he become one of them? Can he imitate their voices? Can he change his skin, right? And it's almost less of a refusal to become one of them than it is he just can't. It doesn't work, right? Is his immunity something that he is consciously trying to move forward on? Or is it just simply that he is still too lazy, too outside of society to really become a fascist, right? He just doesn't care enough to do it. I think that the play presents that uncomfortable question to us, and we do have to deal with it, right? When we look at the rest of the characters in the play, right, that eventually do become rhinoceros, right? Daisy, who eventually becomes a rhinoceros, Botard, who eventually becomes a rhinoceros, Dudar, who eventually becomes a rhinoceros, right? Many of them seem to change because there just simply is, it's enticing, right? Other people are doing it. It seems like it's sort of the thing to do. It doesn't seem like it's a benefit to remain obstinate, right? As you become outnumbered, you become less likely to, oppose it because, if everybody else is doing it, I'm probably better, right? Or else I'm going to look like the odd one out, or I'm going to be in danger, right, of being described as, a nonconformist. I don't want to do that. Berenger has no such qualms, right? He has no qualms at all. Even up to the end of the play, he remains nervous, he remains an alcoholic. He thinks he could be happy with Daisy, but, is also unable to accept that she would consider becoming a rhinoceros, and eventually sort of causes her to leave. So what do we take away from all of this? Well, let's talk about it.